The unexpected encounter. The early morning sun bathed the Los Angeles International Airport in a soft golden glow. Travelers hurried past one another, dragging suitcases, clutching passports, and whispering hurried goodbyes. Among the noise, the polished glass windows reflected the city's promise: endless dreams, countless departures, and infinite arrivals. Keanu Reeves walked quietly through the terminal. He wore a simple black jacket, faded jeans, and sunglasses that shielded him not just from the California light, but from the curious glances that often followed him. Fame had been both a gift and a burden in his life, one he carried with grace. Unlike many celebrities who demanded private jets or VIP treatment, Keanu often traveled like anyone else, blending into the crowd. He didn't need luxury to feel important. He knew true value came from the small things: a kind word, a helping hand, or even just silence in a noisy world. Today, though, his journey would be different. Not because of the destination, but because of an encounter that would ripple outward in ways neither he nor those around him could predict. The flight begins. Boarding had just begun for the first-class cabin of Flight 726 to New York. Keanu entered quietly, nodding politely to the flight attendants who smiled in recognition. He slid into his seat by the window, placing a worn leather book on the tray table, a collection of essays on philosophy he had been reading. Not long after, another man entered. His name was Charles Brennan. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored gray suit, and with an air of arrogance about him, Charles was the kind of businessman who believed the world revolved around status. His watch gleamed under the cabin lights, a statement piece he often flaunted during conversations. Charles glanced at Keanu, at first not recognizing him. Then, with a smirk tugging at his lips, he leaned toward a fellow passenger and whispered just loud enough to be overheard. "Can you believe this guy? He looks like he just rolled out of a thrift store. And this is first class?" The words carried a sting, though Keanu remained silent. He had endured worse, both in Hollywood and in life. Instead of responding, he smiled faintly and returned to his book. But Charles wasn't finished. "You know, some people don't belong in certain places," Charles continued, this time speaking directly to Keanu. "First class is for professionals, not, well, whatever it is you are." Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendants pretended not to notice, though their eyes betrayed disapproval. Keanu paused, closed his book gently, and looked at Charles with calm eyes. There was no anger, no defensiveness, and only a deep, quiet strength that seemed to silence the noise around him. "A lesson in presence, sir," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying a kindness that contrasted with Charles's harsh tone. "Every seat on this plane leads to the same sky." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Charles blinked, unsure how to respond. He had expected a defensive retort, maybe even an argument. But this man, this stranger, had answered with something he couldn't quite dismiss. One of the nearby passengers, a young woman traveling to visit her sick mother, leaned forward. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Keanu smiled at her, then reopened his book. For the first time in years, Charles felt the sharp sting of shame, but pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. He shifted in his seat, pulling out his phone and pretending to be busy. The ripple effect as the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Where there had been tension, there was now curiosity. Who was this man who had answered insult with wisdom? The young woman who had spoken earlier, named Emily, found herself replaying Keanu's words. Every seat leads to the same sky. It reminded her that despite her struggles, working 2 jobs, saving every penny to help her mother's treatments, she was no less valuable than the wealthy executives around her. Across the aisle, an elderly veteran closed his eyes and smiled, recalling the simplicity of life's truths. Even the flight attendants, though professional in demeanor, exchanged subtle nods of respect as they served drinks and meals. And Charles? Though he tried to mask it, his thoughts were unsettled. For years he had measured success in dollars, promotions, and possessions, yet this stranger had shaken that foundation with a single sentence. An act of kindness. Hours into the flight, turbulence struck. The plane jolted, rattling trays and spilling drinks. Gasps echoed through the cabin. Emily clutched her armrest, her knuckles white. Keanu noticed and gently reached over. "It's all right," he said reassuringly. Just a reminder that we're not in control of everything, and that's okay. His calm presence eased her panic. Slowly, her breathing steadied. Meanwhile, Charles dropped his phone, which slid under his seat. Grumbling, he struggled to retrieve it, but the confined space made it nearly impossible. Without hesitation, Keanu bent down, retrieved the phone, and handed it back. "Here you go," he said with a smile. Charles stared at him, stunned. After insulting this man, after mocking him, he had expected nothing but indifference. Yet here Keanu was, extending kindness where most would have turned away. The weight of silence. The plane had landed hours ago, yet the memory of that flight still lingered in the minds of those who had shared the journey. Some passengers walked away with only a passing story to tell their families, but for others, especially Charles, the encounter left an echo he couldn't silence, an uneasy reflection. Charles Brennan stepped into his hotel suite in Manhattan, the city lights glittering through the glass like 1,000 watchful eyes. Normally, arriving in New York filled him with pride. His meetings, his deals, his expensive dinners, all were trophies he collected as proof of success. But that night he couldn't focus. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. Every seat leads to the same sky. The words replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Why had they unsettled him so much? He had heard motivational speeches before. He had read self-help books when the market demanded optimism. But this was different. This wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't a performance. It was said by a man who believed it. And that man, Keanu Reeves, as Charles finally realized after Googling him, had no reason to treat him kindly after the insults. Yet he had. For the first time in years, Charles felt small, not because of failure, but because of emptiness. Meanwhile, across the city, Keanu, on the other hand, stepped out of the terminal quietly, unnoticed by most. He carried no entourage, no flashing cameras followed him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He walked into the cool evening air of Manhattan, blending into the crowd of ordinary people with briefcases, shopping bags, and hurried steps. To him, this was freedom, the freedom of anonymity. He wasn't there for luxury or business meetings. Instead, his trip had a quiet purpose: to visit a children's hospital where he had been secretly funding programs for years. To Keanu, true wealth was not in what you kept, but in what you gave away. The hospital visit the next morning. Keanu arrived at St. Andrew's Children's Hospital, carrying 2 bags, one filled with books, the other with toys. The children lit up as he entered the playroom. Some knew who he was, their faces glowing with excitement. Others were too young to care about Hollywood. They just saw a kind man who knelt down to play blocks with them, who listened to their stories as if each word mattered more than the last. One boy, hooked up to IV tubes, whispered, "You look like the guy from the movies." Keanu smiled warmly. "Maybe, but today I just want to be your friend." For hours he read stories aloud, laughed with the children, and even joined in a game of charades. Nurses and parents watched with admiration, their burdens briefly lifted by the joy in the room. What no one knew was that Keanu had already donated millions to the hospital's cancer research program, insisting that his name remain anonymous. To him, kindness was never a performance. It was a duty, a chance encounter. Later that afternoon, as Keanu stepped outside the hospital, he found himself face to face with someone unexpected: Charles Brennan. Dressed once again in his tailored suit, Charles had come to the hospital for a business-related charity partnership his company was sponsoring. When he saw Keanu, his heart skipped. He hadn't planned to see him again so soon, and certainly not here. "You," Charles muttered, almost in disbelief. Keanu turned, recognizing him instantly. But instead of anger, his eyes reflected the same calm warmth as before. "Hello again," he said kindly. Charles swallowed hard. For a moment, words failed him. Then, almost against his own nature, he admitted, "I owe you an apology. For what I said on the plane." Keanu studied him quietly. Then he nodded. "Apologies are never easy, but they matter." Charles felt a weight lift, though his pride still resisted fully surrendering. "I don't understand you," he confessed. "Most people in your position, they'd hold a grudge. But you just..." He shook his head. "Why?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Because carrying bitterness is heavier than forgiving." The seeds of change that night, Charles returned to his suite. But this time the city outside felt different. The neon lights didn't dazzle him as they used to. Instead, he found himself thinking about the hospital. He thought about the children who laughed despite their pain. He thought about Keanu, sitting on the floor building blocks with kids who barely knew who he was. And he thought about himself, a man who had measured worth by luxury and status, yet found himself empty in a room full of gold. For the first time in years, Charles began to question what success truly meant. A conversation with the past 2 days later. Charles returned to the hospital not for business but for himself. He asked the staff if he could volunteer for an afternoon, surprised when they welcomed him. He spent the day reading to children, awkward at first, but gradually more at ease. One little girl no older than 6 handed him a drawing of a stick figure family holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "Is this for me?" Charles asked, touched. She nodded. "So you don't feel lonely?" Her words pierced deeper than any insult could. That evening, Charles sat alone, staring at the drawing. For the first time in decades, he thought of his own childhood, of his mother working double shifts, of the father who had left, of the hunger that drove him to chase wealth so he'd never feel small again. He realized now, all the money in the world hadn't filled the emptiness he carried since he was a boy. But maybe kindness could. The mirror of humanity, a city that never sleeps, New York pulsed with its usual rhythm. The taxis honking, the skyscrapers glittering, the sidewalks alive with stories overlapping like music in a symphony. But for Charles Brennan, the city no longer felt the same. Since his encounters with Keanu Reeves and his unexpected visit to the children's hospital, the lens through which he saw the world had shifted. He noticed small things he'd once ignored. The weary smile of a janitor mopping marble floors, the patience of a bus driver waiting for a late passenger, the quiet dignity of a homeless man sharing his sandwich with a stray dog. Each act of humanity seemed to echo the lesson he had heard on that flight. Every seat leads to the same sky, and though Charles still carried his businessman's armor, the suits, the schedules, the phone calls, cracks were beginning to form. Keanu in the shadows, while Charles wrestled with his conscience. Keanu moved through the city with the same humility that had defined his life. One evening, he walked into a small bookstore tucked away in the village. The store owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. Keanu didn't mention his name, and she didn't ask. Instead, he browsed quietly, picking up a collection of poetry by Rainer Maria Rilke. As he read the first few lines, he thought about the children at the hospital. Their resilience, their laughter despite suffering, reminded him of the poets and philosophers he admired, people who had faced life's harshest storms yet found beauty in the rain. "Find something you like?" the owner asked as he approached the counter. Keanu nodded, handing her the book. "Yes, something worth carrying," the woman smiled. "Books are the light we hold in dark places." Her words stayed with him long after he left. Crossroads the next morning, fate placed Keanu and Charles in the same orbit again. Both men had been invited to a charity gala hosted in Central Park, organized to fund educational programs for underprivileged youth. Charles arrived in his usual manner, polished, rehearsed, carrying the mask of confidence he wore at corporate events. Keanu arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, dressed simply, blending into the crowd. As speeches were made and donations announced, Charles found himself scanning the room until his eyes landed on Keanu, who stood at the back speaking softly to a group of volunteers. No cameras followed him, no spotlight sought him out, yet the authenticity in his presence radiated more than the wealth displayed on stage. When the gala ended, Charles approached him. "You're everywhere I turn," Charles said, half smiling. Keanu looked at him curiously. "Maybe you're just starting to notice the places kindness leads you," Charles exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You're making me question everything I've built." Keanu placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then maybe you're building something new." The dinner that changed everything later that evening. Charles invited Keanu to dinner, not at a Michelin star restaurant, but at a modest diner near Times Square. It was a surprising choice for Charles, who usually dined only at exclusive establishments. As they sat in a booth with red leather seats, the waitress poured coffee into chipped mugs. Charles hesitated before speaking. "I grew up with nothing," he admitted. "My father left when I was young. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. I told myself that once I made money, once I had power, I'd never feel small again. Keanu listened quietly, his eyes steady, his demeanor patient. But here I am, Charles continued, with more money than I ever dreamed of. And I've never felt smaller. For a long moment, the only sound was the clinking of silverware from nearby tables. Finally, Keanu spoke. Emptiness isn't filled by what we own, it's filled by what we give. Charles stared into his coffee, the steam rising like a veil. He realized then that he had spent decades chasing shadows, while this man sitting across from him, a man who had known both immense success and devastating loss, had chosen light. A test of character, the next week brought an unexpected challenge. Charles's company faced a major crisis. A whistleblower revealed unethical practices in one of its overseas branches. The news spread quickly, investors panicked, and Charles's empire trembled. For years, his instinct would have been to silence the problem, to cover it up, to protect the brand at all costs. But now the words of Keanu echoed in his mind. Carrying bitterness is heavier than forgiving. Emptiness is filled by what we give. For the first time, Charles made a different choice. He called a press conference, stood before the cameras, and admitted fault. He promised full accountability, pledged to compensate the affected workers, and vowed to rebuild with transparency. The backlash was immediate. Stock prices fell, critics sneered. But something unexpected also happened. People respected his honesty. For the first time, Charles was being seen not as a ruthless executive, but as a man willing to face the truth, and deep down, he felt lighter. A meeting of worlds days later, Charles met Keanu again at the hospital. This time, he wasn't there out of guilt or business owing. He was there because he wanted to be. Together, they spent the afternoon with the children. Charles read a story aloud while Keanu acted out the parts, making the kids laugh until their cheeks ached. Afterward, as they walked down the hospital corridor, Charles turned to Keanu. "You've given me more than advice," he said quietly. "You've given me a new life." Keanu shook his head gently. "I didn't give you anything. You just chose to see what was always there." Charles smiled, and for the first time in years, it was genuine. The turning point, the ripple of choices news of Charles Brennan's public admission spread like wildfire. The headlines painted contrasting pictures. Some called him reckless for exposing his company's flaws. Others hailed him brave for embracing honesty in a world that rarely rewarded it. But in the quiet moments, when cameras weren't flashing and investors weren't shouting, Charles felt something new: peace. For the first time in decades, he wasn't running from shadows. He wasn't fighting to protect an image. He was simply telling the truth. And the surprising thing was this: people around him began to change too. Employees who once feared him now looked at him with respect. Associates who had kept their distance now reached out with genuine warmth. His choice had created ripples far larger than he anticipated. But the greatest change wasn't in the boardrooms or the newspapers. It was in his own heart, Keanu's quiet philosophy. Meanwhile, Keanu continued his own path in New York with the same humility as always. He rarely attended the glamorous parties, instead choosing moments that mattered. A late-night walk through the park, a shared sandwich with a homeless man on the corner, an afternoon at the children's hospital. For him, kindness wasn't about the grand gesture. It was about presence. One evening, sitting at a small cafe with Charles, he explained his view. "Life is a fragile thing," Keanu said softly, stirring his tea. "We spend so much time trying to make it permanent, and with money, with fame, with control. But permanence is an illusion. What lasts are the small choices. A smile, a kindness, a moment of honesty. Those are the things people carry." Charles leaned back, absorbing the words. "But you've had so much taken from you. Your father, your sister, your partner. How do you still choose kindness?" Keanu paused, his gaze distant. "Because pain is a teacher. It can either harden us or soften us. I chose to let it soften me." Charles nodded slowly. For the first time, he began to understand that resilience wasn't about building walls. It was about opening doors. The invitation weeks later, Charles invited Keanu to an event unlike the galas they'd attended before. This wasn't a high society gathering or a business conference. It was a community dinner in the Bronx organized by a local shelter that fed families in need. Keanu accepted without hesitation. When they arrived, The atmosphere was warm and humble. Long tables were covered with simple tablecloths. Steaming trays of food lined the walls and laughter filled the air. Children darted between the tables while volunteers served plates with genuine smiles. Keanu and Charles rolled up their sleeves and joined in, serving meals, refilling cups, listening to stories of struggle and resilience. One woman, holding her young daughter close, told Charles, "You don't know what this means to us. A warm meal, a safe place, a little kindness, and it's everything." Her words hit him harder than any stock market swing ever had. The mirror of humanity. After the dinner, Charles and Keanu walked through the chilly streets, their breath visible in the night air. "You know," Charles said, "for years I thought strength was about power, about winning, about controlling the game. But tonight, strength looked like a mother smiling at her child, even though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring." Keanu nodded. "Strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing again, and sometimes it's about helping someone else stand." They stopped at a small park where children's laughter echoed from the playground. For Charles, it felt like looking into a mirror, a reflection of the humanity he had long ignored but was now learning to embrace. A pivotal Cologne night, Charles received a phone call that would test everything he had learned. His board demanded he reverse his public stance on the company scandal. They wanted silence, denial, and a return to business as usual. If he refused, they threatened to remove him as CEO. The old Charles would have fought tooth and nail to protect his position. But the man sitting in his study that night staring at the city lights felt different. He picked up his phone and called Keanu. "I'm at a crossroads," Charles admitted. "If I keep my position, I have to betray the truth. If I tell the truth, I lose everything I've built." Keanu's voice was calm on the other end. "Then the question is, what have you really built? Something worth keeping or something worth leaving behind?" Silence filled the line. For the first time in his life, Charles understood that legacy wasn't measured in buildings or bank accounts. It was measured in people, in moments, in the weight of one's choices. The decision. The next morning, Charles walked into the boardroom, the air thick with expectation. His directors watched him, some impatient, others fearful. He stood at the head of the table and said clearly, "I will not bury the truth. If that costs me this position, so be it, but I would rather lose power than lose myself." Gasps echoed around the room. Some tried to argue, others threatened, but Charles stood firm, and in that moment he felt freer than he ever had in his life. By the end of the week, the board voted him out. For many, it was a fall from grace. For Charles, it was liberation. The light beyond loss. When Charles met Keanu later, he expected pity. Instead, Keanu smiled. "Congratulations," Keanu said warmly. Charles laughed bitterly. "Congratulations? I just lost everything." "No," Keanu corrected gently. "You just made space for everything that matters." Charles thought about it, and slowly his laughter turned genuine. For the first time in years, the weight he carried was gone. The trial of fire. The first real test. The Brennan Foundation had grown far beyond Charles's expectations. What began in a small community room was now spreading across boroughs, with mentorship programs in high schools, after-school support centers, and scholarships opening doors for kids who had once been forgotten. But with growth came challenges. Rumors began to circulate in the media. Was the foundation just a cover for Charles's damaged reputation? Were the donations truly reaching the children? Or was this another corporate scheme? Old rivals in the business world whispered to reporters, eager to drag him back into scandal. The headlines grew harsher, questioning his motives, doubting his sincerity. Charles felt the old panic rise, the fear of losing everything again, the instinct to fight, to silence critics, to defend his name with force. But then he remembered Keanu's calm words, "Carrying bitterness is heavier than forgiving." Keanu's counsel one evening. Charles met Keanu in Central Park, the city lights glowing softly beyond the trees. "I can't take it anymore," Charles admitted, his voice heavy. "No matter what I do, people doubt me. They say I'm pretending, that this foundation is nothing but a PR stunt." Keanu listened quietly, his hands resting on the back of a park bench. After a moment, he said, "Let them talk." Charles blinked. "What do you mean?" "People will always have opinions," Keanu said. "But opinions aren't truth. Truth is what those kids feel when they walk into your programs. Truth is the opportunities they're given, the doors that open. You can't silence doubt. You can only outlive it. The words struck Charles deeply. He realized then that his work wasn't about proving himself to the world. It was about proving hope to the people who needed it most. The betrayal. Within, just as things began to stabilize, another challenge emerged, not from outside, but from within. One of the foundation's early administrators, a man Charles had trusted, was caught embezzling funds. The scandal threatened to undo everything, confirming the critics' suspicions and putting the entire mission at risk. When Charles confronted him, the man sneered. "You really thought you could run a charity without corruption? You're naive, Brennan. Everyone has an angle." Charles's fist clenched, old instincts screaming for vengeance. But then he saw Keanu in his mind's eye. Steady, calm, forgiving. Instead of rage, Charles said quietly, "You're wrong. Not everyone has an angle. Some of us just want to help." He reported the crime transparently, released a public statement, and vowed to rebuild stronger safeguards. The media had a field day, but the community saw something else. Honesty. And in the long run, honesty outweighed scandal. A child's letter weeks later, Charles received a letter that shifted everything. It was from a 15-year-old girl named Sophia, whose life had been touched by the Foundation's mentorship program. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Brennan, before I joined your program, I thought I didn't matter. I thought the world only cared about people with money and power. But you showed me that even someone like me has a future. You gave me a reason to believe. Thank you for not giving up, even when people tried to stop you." Charles read the letter over and over, tears blurring his vision. It was the reminder he needed. Proof that even amid storms, the seeds of kindness were taking root. Keanu's hidden struggle. Though Keanu remained a rock for Charles, he too carried quiet struggles. He had recently wrapped filming on a demanding project, and the exhaustion, physical and emotional, that weighed heavily. Late at night, he sometimes sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city skyline, thinking of those he had lost, his sister, his partner, the life paths cut short. But when he read Sophia's letter shared with him by Charles, he felt something stir. He thought, this is why I keep going. This is why kindness matters. Because somewhere, someone carries hope because of it. The Turning Point Gala. The Foundation decided to host its first official gala, not a glitzy spectacle for elites, but a gathering of the very students and families they served. The venue was simple, a repurposed warehouse decorated with student artwork, photographs, and handwritten stories of transformation. As Charles walked onto the stage, nervous, he glanced at Keanu in the crowd. Keanu gave a small nod, a silent assurance. Charles spoke not as a former CEO, but as a man who had fallen and learned to rise again. "This foundation is not about me," he said. "It's about you. The dreamers, the fighters, the ones who remind us that strength is not measured by what we own, but by how much hope we can give away." The audience rose to its feet in applause. For Charles, it wasn't about recognition, it was about resonance. He saw it in their eyes, they believed. The private conversation. After the event, Charles and Keanu stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them. "You know," Charles said, smiling faintly, "I used to think losing my company was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I see it was the best." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes the fire that destroys is the same fire that forges." Charles looked at him with gratitude. "You were that fire, Keanu. You burned away the lies I was living." Keanu shook his head gently. "No, you lit your own fire. I just reminded you that you had the match." The ripple expands. In the months that followed, the Brennan Foundation grew into something neither man could have imagined. Other cities reached out, asking for branches. Volunteers multiplied. Former students returned to become mentors themselves. The story of a disgraced CEO finding redemption through kindness began to circulate, not as gossip, but as inspiration. And though Keanu never sought the spotlight, those who knew the truth whispered his name with respect. Because behind Charles's transformation was the quiet strength of a man who believed in kindness above all else. The legacy of Light a Storm Descends. It was a summer evening when the skies over New York turned dark. Heavy rain battered the streets and winds howled against the skyscrapers. By midnight, a storm unlike any the city had seen in years swept through. flooding subways, toppling trees, and cutting power in entire neighborhoods. In the chaos, the Brennan Foundation's community center in the Bronx, the heart of their work, became an emergency shelter. Families poured in, drenched and frightened, carrying what little they could salvage. Charles rushed to the center, his suit soaked, his heart pounding. Inside, volunteers scrambled to organize blankets, food, and dry clothing. Children cried, clinging to their parents, and there, moving quietly among the chaos, was Keanu. He carried boxes of supplies, comforted children, and reassured anxious parents with the same calm voice that had silenced cruelty on a plane months before. When Charles arrived, Keanu gave him a nod. No words were needed. Both men knew this was the true test. Leading through service, the storm raged for hours. The roof leaked, supplies ran short, and tension threatened to boil over. At one point, a group of frightened teenagers began arguing with volunteers, convinced there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. Charles stepped forward, his voice steady. "There will be enough, because we will make it enough." He rolled up his sleeves and joined the kitchen crew, serving soup, handing out bread, pouring water. The CEO, who once signed billion-dollar contracts, now stood shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, not as a leader above them, but as a servant among them. Keanu moved through the shelter with quiet grace, telling stories to restless children, making them laugh despite the storm. To the parents, he offered reassurance. "You're safe here. We'll get through this together." By dawn, when the storm finally subsided, the shelter had held firm, not because of walls or wealth, but because of unity. A conversation in the quiet as the sun rose, painting the city in gold. Charles and Keanu sat on the steps outside the shelter. Exhausted, soaked, but alive, Charles looked at the horizon. "I used to think legacy was about buildings, companies, monuments. But last night, legacy looked like a blanket around a child, a bowl of soup, a room full of people who believed in each other." Keanu smiled faintly. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind for people. It's what you leave behind in them." Charles nodded, his eyes wet. "You've changed my life, Keanu. I don't know how to repay that." Keanu's gaze was steady. "Live it forward. That's all the repayment kindness ever asks." Years later, time passed. The Brennan Foundation grew far beyond New York. Programs expanded to cities across the country, then overseas. Charles became known not as the disgraced CEO of yesterday, but as the man who turned failure into fuel for change. But if you asked him, he would say the credit didn't belong to him. It belonged to every child who dared to dream, every volunteer who gave their time, and to a man who taught him that every seat leads to the same sky. Keanu continued his life with the same humility. He made films, yes, but his true joy remained in the quiet acts, visiting hospitals, supporting families, sharing meals with strangers. He never sought recognition, and yet, his influence echoed louder than fame. The final encounter. One evening, many years later, Charles and Keanu met again at the same diner where their friendship had deepened. The waitress, older now, greeted them warmly. They sat in their usual booth, sipping coffee from chipped mugs. Charles, his hair gray, his face lined with years of both struggle and joy, looked across the table. "Do you ever think about that flight?" "The day this all began?" Keanu chuckled softly. "I do. Funny how one sentence can change everything." Charles raised his mug. "To every seat, leading to the same sky." Keanu clinked his mug gently against his, "and to the kindness that keeps us flying." They sat in silence after that. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding, the kind only true friends share. The legacy lives on long after both men were gone. Their story continued to be told. Not in newspapers or films, but in the lives of the countless people they had touched. In the teenager who became a doctor because of a scholarship. In the mother who rebuilt her life after the storm, inspired by a night of kindness. In the volunteers who passed on the lesson that real strength is found not in power, but in compassion, and in every child who walked into a Brennan Foundation Center and was told, "You already matter." Their names became less important than their message. Because the true legacy of Keanu Reeves and Charles Brennan was not wealth, fame, or recognition. It was the quiet, unstoppable truth that kindness, even in the smallest act, can change a life, and changing one life can change the world.